On the evening of July 31, 1976, Big Thompson Canyon carried the ordinary traffic of a summer weekend. The canyon stretches for 25 miles through the Front Range of Colorado, cutting a path between Estes Park in the high country and the plains near Loveland. Colorado State Highway 34 follows the Big Thompson River closely through this corridor, a two-lane road that winds alongside the water for its entire length. The canyon is a classic mountain passage. Steep granite walls rising hundreds of feet on both sides, a narrow valley floor where the river, the road, and thin strips of vegetation occupy nearly all available space. The geology is ancient and unyielding. The walls are Precambrian granite and metamorphic rock, exposed by millions of years of erosion. The floodplain is narrow, in many places only wide enough for the road, the river, and a thin margin of willow and cottonwood. There are few wide spots. Where the canyon opened slightly, small communities had developed, clusters of cabins, modest motels, a handful of campgrounds and picnic areas. Most of the canyon, however, is confined. The road clings to the south side of the river in some sections, crosses to the north in others, always constrained by the terrain. Campers had set up along the riverbanks that evening. Families occupied picnic tables at developed sites. Tents dotted the gravel bars near the water. Small campfires burned in metal rings. Children waded in the shallow current. The river itself ran clear and low, typical for late July. Snowmelt from the high country had passed weeks earlier, and the summer base flow was modest, ankle-deep in most places, perhaps knee-deep in the pools. The water made a quiet sound over the rocks, steady and unremarkable. Traffic moved through the canyon in both directions. Vehicles heading back toward Loveland after a day in Rocky Mountain National Park or Estes Park. Others arriving for the evening, pulling campers or carrying fishing gear. The canyon was a popular recreation corridor, especially on summer weekends. The air was warm, the sky still bright in the long evening light of late July. There was no sense of urgency, no indication that the evening would be anything other than routine. The canyon had no alternate routes. Highway 34 was the only paved road through this section of the Front Range. A few dirt roads branched off toward cabins or trailheads, but they ended quickly against the slopes or led only to dead-end properties. The canyon was a single-option corridor, one road in, the same road out. The geography was scenic precisely because it was confining. The walls rose steeply, the river ran through the bottom, and the road threaded the narrow space between. Nothing in the evening air suggested disruption. The canyon was doing what it had done for thousands of summers, carrying a river, holding a road, hosting visitors who appreciated its beauty and remoteness. By late afternoon on July 31, a slow-moving line of thunderstorms had formed along the Front Range. Moist air from the plains was lifting against the eastern slopes of the Rockies, forced upward by the terrain. This orographic lifting is common in summer, when afternoon heating drives thunderstorm development along the mountain front. On most days, these storms move eastward with the prevailing upper-level winds, spreading rain across a broad area as they travel onto the plains. But on this day, the atmospheric conditions created something less common, a storm system that stalled. The upper-level winds were weak, offering little steering current to push the storms away from the mountains. At the same time, a low-level circulation pattern was feeding moisture continuously into the same location. The result was a conveyor belt of humid air rising against the slopes, condensing and falling as rain, all within a narrow geographic area. Individual thunderstorm cells formed, matured, and dissipated over the headwaters of the Big Thompson River and its tributaries. Each new cell released its moisture over the same drainage basin. The storms did not move. They simply regenerated in place. This pattern, sometimes called a training echo in meteorological terms, is capable of producing extreme rainfall totals over small areas. The Big Thompson Basin covers about 300 square miles, much of it steep terrain between 7,000 and 11,000 feet in elevation. The storm complex sat directly over the upper portions of this basin, anchored by the topography and the atmospheric setup. Rainfall rates in the most intense cells exceeded 4 inches per hour, an extraordinary rate even for thunderstorms. In 1976, the tools available for detecting and forecasting such events were limited. Doppler radar, which can measure rainfall intensity and storm motion with precision, was still in experimental stages and not yet deployed operationally. Weather forecasts relied on surface observations, upper-air soundings from twice-daily balloon launches, and satellite images with limited spatial and temporal resolution. There were no real-time rainfall gauges in the upper Big Thompson Basin. Observers could see the storms on satellite imagery and conventional radar, but the intensity and stationary nature of the rainfall were not immediately apparent. The National Weather Service office in Denver issued a flash flood watch for the Front Range that afternoon, a routine precaution during thunderstorm season. The watch covered a large area and did not specify the Big Thompson Canyon. Flash flood watches were common in summer, and the public response to them was often muted. There was no mechanism to communicate the difference between a typical watch and the event that was already developing. The storm continued to strengthen through the evening, unseen by most, undetected in its full intensity by the tools of the time. Rainfall began in earnest around sunset, just as visibility declined and the canyon entered darkness. Rain began falling heavily in the upper reaches of the Big Thompson Canyon and its tributaries shortly after sunset. It struck bare rock and thin soil with little capacity for absorption. The slopes of the Front Range are steep, often exceeding 30 or 40 degrees. Above the canyon floor, vegetation is sparse, mostly grasses, scattered pines, and exposed granite. The soil layer is thin, often only a few inches deep, developed slowly over bedrock that sheds water rather than absorbing it. When rain falls at ordinary rates, some infiltration occurs and runoff develops gradually. But when rain falls at 4 inches per hour onto slopes with minimal soil and steep gradients, runoff forms immediately. The sound of water became pervasive. Rain hammered against rock with a steady roar. Streams formed on slopes that had been dry minutes earlier, cutting narrow channels through loose gravel and pine needles. The smell of wet rock and disturbed soil filled the air. Within the first hour, small tributaries that were normally dry gullies began carrying visible flows. These tributaries, with names like Fall River, Fox Creek, and Dry Gulch, drain the high country directly into the Big Thompson. Under normal conditions, they contribute modestly to the river. On this night, they became torrents. Rainfall rates in some locations exceeded 4 inches per hour, sustained for multiple hours. Over the course of the evening, portions of the drainage received between 10 and 12 inches of rain. The town of Glen Haven, near the head of the canyon, recorded over 7 inches. Drake, further downstream, recorded similar totals. These amounts represent what would normally fall over several months, concentrated into 4 or 5 hours. The rain did not come in brief bursts separated by lulls. It was continuous, heavy, and unrelenting. The canyon's hydrology is simple and unforgiving. Water that falls on the slopes moves downward rapidly. There are no broad valleys to slow it, no wetlands or meadows to absorb it, no reservoirs to capture it. The Big Thompson River is the single drainage channel for the entire basin, and in most places, that channel is confined between vertical walls. Under normal conditions, the river carries a few dozen cubic feet per second in late summer. On this night, flow rates would eventually exceed 31,000 cubic feet per second, more than 500 times the normal flow. The conversion from rainfall to runoff was nearly instantaneous. Observers near the upper canyon noted that small streams went from dry to raging within 20 minutes. The river itself began to darken with sediment, picking up the color of disturbed soil and pulverized rock. The current quickened. The sound of moving water grew louder, echoing off the canyon walls. By 9 o'clock in the evening, the river was visibly swollen, lapping at the edges of the road in places where it normally ran 10 feet away. The rain continued without pause. Tributaries continued to surge. The river had nowhere to go but downstream, and the canyon offered no room for it to spread. By 10 o'clock in the evening, the Big Thompson River had left its banks entirely. The narrow floodplain, never more than a few dozen yards wide, disappeared beneath moving water. What had been a clear, shallow river was now a turbid, debris-laden flood occupying the full width of the canyon floor. Highway 34, built on fill and supported by culverts and small bridges along the river, began to fail in multiple locations. The roadbed, constructed decades earlier without consideration for extreme floods, was not designed to withstand lateral pressure or undermining from fast-moving water. The current attacked the road from below and from the side. Culverts that normally carried small tributary streams became choke points where water backed up, then surged through with enormous force. Pavement cracked and tilted. Fill material washed out from beneath the road's surface. Entire sections of asphalt broke apart and slid into the flow, leaving gaps 10 or 20 feet wide. The road was not simply overtopped. It was being dismantled, piece by piece, as the flood eroded its foundations. Bridges designed for a river a few feet deep were suddenly submerged to their decks, then overtopped entirely. The force of the current, combined with the impact of debris, exceeded the structural limits of most spans. Several bridges collapsed. The sound of concrete and steel failing added to the roar of the water. Bridges that did not collapse immediately became dams, trapping logs, vehicles, and sections of destroyed buildings against their upstream faces. The pressure built until the debris broke through or the structure gave way. The water carried everything it encountered. Boulders weighing several tons rolled along the riverbed, grinding against each other with a deep, resonant sound. Trees, cottonwoods and pines uprooted from the banks, tumbled in the current, their root balls acting as battering rams. Sections of destroyed road, vehicles, propane tanks, camping trailers, and pieces of buildings moved downstream in the flow. The flood was not clear water. It was a slurry of sediment, rock, wood, and debris, thick and dark, moving with tremendous energy. The canyon offered no room for the water to spread. In a wide valley, a river can overflow its banks and dissipate energy across a broad floodplain. In Big Thompson Canyon, the granite walls confined the flow. The flood occupied the entire width of the corridor, wall to wall. In many sections, the water reached depths of 15 to 20 feet, measured from the normal river level. The current velocity exceeded 15 feet per second in some locations, faster than most people can run, faster than most vehicles can drive through water. Campgrounds situated on low gravel bars were erased within minutes. Tents, picnic tables, fire rings, and vehicles vanished into the current. Small motels and cabins built near the road, structures that had stood for decades, were struck by the leading edge of the flood. Some were pushed off their foundations and carried downstream intact for a short distance before breaking apart. Others were sheared away immediately, reduced to component materials that joined the debris flow. The flood was not a single wave but a sustained flow, rising continuously as rain persisted upstream. Each new pulse of runoff from the tributaries added to the volume moving through the canyon. The river had become a sediment-laden current flowing through what had been a road, a campground, a recreational corridor. The infrastructure, roads, bridges, buildings, had no capacity to contain, redirect, or withstand it. The canyon was functioning as it always had during extreme hydrological events, as a channel, conveying water from the high country to the plains as rapidly as gravity and geometry allowed. Darkness made the event nearly invisible. Power lines running along the canyon had been severed early in the flood, torn down by falling trees or washed away with the road. The canyon went black. There were no streetlights, no building lights, no ambient glow. The only illumination came from vehicle headlights, those still functioning, and occasional lightning from the storm overhead. The sound of moving water, grinding rock, and colliding debris filled the air, but the source and scale of the sound were invisible in the darkness. Telephone lines failed as poles were undermined and toppled. Communication between sections of the canyon ceased. There was no way to call for help, no way to receive information, no way to know what was happening upstream or downstream. People in vehicles or buildings had no information about the scale of the event, how long it would last, or whether the water would continue to rise. The isolation was complete and immediate. Highway 34 was cut in dozens of places. Entire road segments were gone, leaving gaps of exposed bedrock or churning water. Vehicles that had been moving through the canyon when the flood began were stranded on isolated sections of pavement. There was no way forward and no way back. The road ahead had been washed away. The road behind had been washed away. The canyon walls rose steeply on both sides, too steep to climb in daylight, impossible in darkness. Some people made the decision to leave their vehicles and move to higher ground on foot. They climbed the slopes in the dark, feeling for handholds on rock and vegetation, moving upward until they were above the sound of the water. Others remained in their cars, trapped between washouts, hoping the water would not rise further. Some sought refuge in buildings that seemed solid, not knowing whether those structures would hold. The canyon's geometry eliminated meaningful choice. There was one road, and it was disintegrating. There were no side roads that led to safety, only dead ends or routes that climbed briefly and stopped. Warnings could not be transmitted effectively. Law enforcement deputies and emergency responders who attempted to enter the canyon from both ends were stopped by destroyed roads and rising water. The flood was advancing faster than any response could be organized. Radio communication was limited. The event was unfolding across 25 miles of rugged terrain, in darkness, with infrastructure failing continuously. Each section of the canyon was isolated, experiencing the flood independently, without knowledge of what was happening elsewhere. In the upper canyon, near Glen Haven and Drake, the flooding began earlier and peaked first. Residents and visitors in those areas experienced the initial surge, then a sustained high flow for hours. In the middle canyon, the flood arrived later but with added volume from tributary inputs. In the lower canyon, near the mouth where the river emerges onto the plains, the flood manifested as a massive debris flow, a surge of water, mud, rock, and wreckage that spread across the wider valley. The rain continued through the late evening and into the early morning hours. The river continued to rise or remained at peak levels for hours. Time moved slowly in the darkness. People who had climbed to high ground waited, wet and cold, listening to the sound of destruction below. People in vehicles or buildings waited, not knowing if the water would reach them. There was no information, no communication, no light. The canyon had become a trap and the night stretched on. By dawn on August 1, the rain had stopped. The storm system that had remained stationary over the canyon for most of the night had finally moved away. The river began to fall as rapidly as it had risen. Floodwaters withdrew, draining back into the main channel, leaving behind a transformed landscape. As daylight reached into the canyon, the scale of the destruction became visible. The canyon floor was covered in debris. Boulders the size of automobiles had been moved from the riverbed and deposited on what had been the roadway. Mud and gravel covered everything, in some places several feet deep. Splintered wood, fragments of buildings, fences, furniture, lay scattered across the ground. Twisted metal from vehicles, guardrails, and bridge components protruded from debris piles. Overturned cars and trucks sat at odd angles, some crushed, some buried to their windows in sediment. Sections of Highway 34 had been completely removed. In some locations, the roadbed was gone for 100 yards or more, replaced by raw bedrock scraped clean by the force of the current. The granite underneath, normally covered by fill and pavement, was exposed and polished smooth. In other areas, the road's surface was buried under gravel bars deposited by the receding flood. The river had rearranged the entire valley floor, moving sediment from upstream and depositing it wherever the current slowed. Bridges were collapsed or missing entirely. Of the bridges that had spanned the river, only a few remained standing. Most were gone, their abutments left standing in isolation with no span between them. Utility lines hung severed, draped across rocks or trailing in the water. Power poles lay broken along the slopes. Water lines, sewer lines, and gas lines were exposed where the ground around them had been washed away. Buildings that had stood along the road were gone or reduced to foundations. The footprint of a structure might remain, a concrete slab, a basement filled with mud, but the building itself was absent. Pieces of these structures were found downstream, sometimes miles from their original locations. A section of wall, a door frame, a propane tank. The wreckage of entire buildings was mixed with the wreckage of vehicles and the natural debris of the canyon. The river itself had returned to a narrow channel, but it was not the same river. The course had shifted in places, carving new paths through the valley floor. Gravel bars had formed where none existed before. The stream was still running high and muddy, but it was contained again within recognizable banks. The surrounding corridor, however, was unrecognizable. Rescue and recovery operations began as soon as access was possible. Helicopters flew into the canyon at first light, evacuating survivors from isolated locations. Ground crews entered from both ends, moving on foot where the road was impassable. The official count, finalized in the weeks following the flood, recorded 144 deaths. Many bodies were recovered from debris piles or downstream locations in the days following the flood. Some were found in vehicles. Some were found along the riverbanks, miles from where they had been when the flood began. Some were never found, presumed carried far downstream or buried under sediment. The infrastructure damage was near total along a 15-mile stretch of the canyon. Dozens of homes and businesses were destroyed. Hundreds of vehicles were lost. The road would require months to rebuild. The economic cost was measured in tens of millions of dollars, though the loss of life overshadowed all other considerations. The scale of the event exceeded all prior records for the basin. There was no precedent in the historical record, written or oral, for a flood of this magnitude in Big Thompson Canyon. Reconstruction of Highway 34 began within weeks of the flood and continued for more than a year. Engineers redesigned the road with the flood in mind. The new alignment was built at higher grades wherever possible, lifting the roadway above the historical floodplain. Culverts were enlarged and reinforced to accommodate larger tributary flows. Bridges were rebuilt with higher clearances and stronger foundations, designed to withstand flows far greater than the historical maximum. In sections where the canyon was too narrow to elevate the road, the pavement was anchored more securely to bedrock, and additional drainage structures were installed to allow water to pass under or around the roadway rather than overwhelming it. Some sections of the highway were relocated entirely, moved away from the river where the canyon geometry allowed it. These new alignments reduced the road's exposure to future floods, though they also required cutting into the canyon walls and constructing retaining structures. The reconstruction was expensive and slow, but it incorporated the lessons of the flood into every design decision. The new road opened to traffic in late 1977, more functional and more resilient than the road it replaced. The flood prompted changes in land use planning across Colorado's Front Range. Development in narrow canyons and steep drainages became subject to new restrictions. Floodplain mapping was expanded to include mountain streams, which had previously been considered low risk. Building codes were revised to account for flash flood risk in mountain corridors, requiring structures to be set back from stream channels and elevated above estimated flood levels. Permits for new development in canyons were scrutinized more carefully, and some areas were designated as unsuitable for habitation. The National Weather Service began refining its flash flood warning systems in the years following the Big Thompson flood. The event highlighted the limitations of existing forecasting and communication tools. In response, the agency invested in new technology, including the deployment of Doppler radar systems across the country. Automated rain gauges were installed in vulnerable watersheds, providing real-time data on rainfall rates and totals. Flash flood warning protocols were revised to allow for more specific, localized warnings based on observed conditions, rather than broad-area watches. Public awareness of flash flood danger increased significantly. The Big Thompson flood received national attention, and the lessons learned were disseminated through emergency management channels, media coverage, and educational programs. The understanding that steep terrain and confined drainages leave no time for gradual response became part of the public consciousness in mountain communities. Turn around, don't drown campaigns, emphasizing the danger of driving through flooded roads, were developed and adopted widely. The Big Thompson Canyon flood became a reference event in hydrology, meteorology, and emergency management. It has been studied extensively in the decades since, used as a case study for understanding the interaction between extreme rainfall, steep terrain, and infrastructure vulnerability. The event informed flood prediction models, engineering standards, and disaster response protocols. It remains one of the deadliest flash floods in United States history, a reminder of the speed and power with which water can move through confined terrain. The canyon itself remains narrow. The granite walls still rise steeply on both sides of the river. The Big Thompson still drains the same basin, flowing from the high country to the plains. Rain still falls on the Front Range in summer, and thunderstorms still form along the mountain front. The physical setting has not changed, but the corridor is no longer treated as benign. The road is built to accommodate water, not merely to avoid it. Development is limited and regulated. Warning systems are in place, and the public understands the risk. The flood left knowledge carved into the landscape as permanently as the bedrock it exposed. The river moves quietly now through the canyon, contained within its channel, clear and shallow in summer. But the high water marks remain visible on the canyon walls, lines of debris and discoloration showing where the water reached on the night of July 31, 1976. Those marks are read by engineers, hydrologists, and anyone who knows what to look for. They are a record written in stone, a permanent reminder of what the canyon is capable of when conditions align. The river has returned to its normal state, but the canyon is no longer misunderstood.